As I'm speaking to you, Bitcoin is hovering around $93,000. What happened? We're going to go back over Venezuela, the impact on oil, the impact on Bitcoin with a possible American strategic reserve thanks to Venezuela, and a slew of rumors. In any case, there hasn't been this much information in the space of 24 to 48 hours. I'm going to talk to you about it today, but first a quick update about Kojo, especially at the start of this year. Fill out the investment journal here. I'll put the registration link for you to access the app, and we're improving it day by day. You can see here, we've added the BTC investment trend. What's my outlook? Long term, medium, and short term? What's my strategy for these outlooks? Everything is detailed here day by day. That way you'll know exactly whether it's a time to accumulate, buy, or sell. No more RSI indicators, etc. My CD, very complex. Here, it'll be my outlook, compared to a bunch of indicators, whether it's time to buy, time to sell, or time to buy again. You have all of that on the Kojo app. The link is in the description. And we're going to raise the price soon because we're improving the app thanks to all your feedback. And thank you, by the way, for that. By the way, there's a Gem 10 to win this month, so don't hesitate. There was also an iPhone 17 Pro up for grabs for Christmas, and we'll be holding more contests soon. But let's take a direct look at what happened, because we're diving right in, just as Bitcoin hit $93,000. We're starting straight away with the major event of the past 24 hours. I don't know if you've been following along a bit. This series is going to be pretty juicy, pretty interesting to find out what happened. But as you might have guessed, actually, on January 3rd, we had, right at the very beginning, some Chinese officials who went to Venezuela to meet with President Maduro. And 4 hours later, what happened? The United States launched a large-scale strike, actually several airstrikes, on Caracas. And in the aftermath, Donald Trump announced that Maduro and his wife had been captured, then exfiltrated from the country. So, without getting into the geopolitical details here, because that's not the purpose of this channel, even though we do talk about it, macro, technical analysis, geopolitics, macroeconomics, it's still important to understand the general context. That is to say, Venezuela has been a strategic flashpoint for quite a few years, especially when it comes to access to energy resources and also for political alliances with China and its direct opposition to the United States. This is nothing new. But the arrival of a Chinese delegation on site, followed by an American military intervention, clearly shows just how much global power dynamics are hardening. Is this good news? Is this bad news? Let me know in the comments. But what we're interested in here, we're not here to do a full geopolitical analysis, but rather to understand whether this escalation has had a direct impact on the markets. And if so, what kind? We'll take a look at that in a moment. But let's move on now to the direct impact on the market. Here we see something very interesting because at the moment of the attack in Venezuela, Bitcoin dropped very briefly. I was following this very closely as soon as I saw the news come through, because I always ask myself, and maybe you do too, what is the impact on the market, and especially on the market for digital assets? But since then, it has completely reversed. In any case, this trend has reversed. It even broke through $91,000, then $92,000, and then $93,000. So that's more than $3,000 since the lows directly related to the crisis. At the time of the event, exactly $2,500. And at the same time, $83 billion have been reinjected into the market. Cap, crypto, meaning into the overall market capitalization. Let me remind you that we were around 2.80 trillion. Now we're at about $3.17 trillion. And by the way, we'll be talking about trillions of dollars with the US debt in just a moment. It's going to be super fascinating. But we're also talking about $130 million in shorts that were liquidated in just 12 hours. So, in other words, we had another good old family-style short squeeze like we often see when liquidity is low. We can't really complain because for once, the market is in the green. And that's actually the key point. That is, just as a reminder, the traditional markets were closed, so crypto was the only global market still open at that time. And the way investors interpreted the event was instantly reflected in Bitcoin and in a surprisingly bullish way. Why bullish? Because one of the circulating theories is that if the United States strengthens its control over global oil reserves, we'll talk about this in a moment, it could be seen as a huge future support for the American economy. We'll see just how much. By the way, Venezuela is a strategic country, both economically and in terms of oil, if I may say so. And when the US economy gets stronger, global liquidity improves, which usually ends up benefiting Bitcoin, but you already know that, especially when it happens on a weekend. But now the important thing to do is to keep a cool head. Because in fact, this pump actually happened on a Sunday. And you know that liquidity on Sundays is quite low. And this pump, this rise, this bullish push could very well be what we call a fake Sunday pump. But the real confirmation will come when the traditional markets open and in the hours that follow. And for now, the trend continues positively. And if stocks in fact open and stay in the green, and if Bitcoin holds above $91,000, which is currently the case, then this movement will really look like an upward trend. But now let's move on to a point that seems completely unreal. And yet, in fact, these are the numbers. Because according to statements by Donald Trump, the United States now controls Venezuela's oil reserves. And here we're talking about, you can see it in the numbers. Here, 303 billion barrels. And with a barrel trading around $57, that represents, brace yourself, $17.3 trillion. Yes, $17.3 trillion. Let me remind you that the American debt is $38 trillion. And even if you imagine selling at half price, we're still talking about $8.7 trillion. So, just to put things in perspective, that's more than the GDP of every country in the world, except the United States and China. So, it's also 4 times Japan's GDP, and it's even equivalent to 20 years of France's federal budget. Silence. But in other words, in less than 12 hours, that's why I'm telling you, a lot has happened lately. And if these claims are confirmed, the United States would have gotten its hands on the greatest energy and financial windfall in modern history. And here, very few people grasp the scale of the political and economic change this represents. And I wanted to talk to you about it on The Daily Show because my goal is to break it down for you, to explain it to you. What is the impact specifically of this military attack, but also economic and also financial? And when these global tectonic plates shift to such an extent, the markets and the crypto market included react immediately, not because they understand all the details, but because they anticipate what it means for the dollar, as well as for American economic power and global liquidity. And I think you can easily understand that. Let's move on to another piece of information that's also been circulating a lot since last night and is extremely, extremely important. Above all, don't hesitate to share this information in WhatsApp or Telegram groups to educate and inform others. It's really important. I'm sharing it with you, so don't hesitate to pass it on. But if this information turns out to be true, it will be absolutely historic, and I'll explain why. But above all, I want to stress that after personally checking the sources, I try to give you information and verify it with real sources. Nothing is 100% confirmed, so take it with a grain of salt, because the figures I'm about to give you actually come from leaks or also from intelligence reports and anonymous sources. So it's not something you see publicly. And you really have to, well, be careful because it's not 100% certain. But according to several reports, the Venezuelan regime has secretly accumulated a shadow reserve of Bitcoin and Tether. All right? So the USDT behind it, which was built up over years to circumvent sanctions. And the first estimates talk about what is called a shadow reserve. So a reserve in the shadows that would rival MicroStrategy. Yes, the famous company of Michael Saylor, which has been accumulating for quite a few years now. Since 2022 to be exact, Bitcoin. And here you really see the scale of it. And all of this supposedly started before MicroStrategy. We're talking about 2018, because Caracas is said to have liquidated billions of dollars of their gold reserves to convert them into Bitcoin at a price, get this, around $5,000. And just with that operation, they would have accumulated around 400,000 BTC. And today, at the current price, that would represent $36 billion. Then, when their national crypto, the Petro, failed, they supposedly pivoted to USDT to discreetly sell oil before converting it again, at least part of it, into Bitcoin to avoid address freezes. And the overall estimates, brace yourself, this is off the charts, completely crazy. We're talking about 600,000 to 660,000 BTC, which is $56 to $67 billion at the current rate. And to top it all off, there's an incredible twist going around, because Alex Saab, who is the mastermind behind this accumulation for the regime, he would actually be an informant for the DEA, the American Intelligence Service, and has been since 2016. So that would just be huge. And it would mean that Washington has been watching the building of this reserve live for years. We're talking since 2018. And now, with the announced capture of Maduro, a huge question arises. Who actually holds those famous private keys? Is it the army? Is it people close to the regime? Or is it the United States who could get their hands on it and actually add it to their strategy? Bitcoin reserve, their strategic Bitcoin reserve. So let me repeat, there is no official source that has confirmed these figures for now, but if all this is confirmed in the coming days, it would be one of the biggest transfers of Bitcoin wealth in the world, in all of history. Anyway, and by the way, we're going to talk about Greenland, surprisingly. We're also going to talk about Colombia, because Venezuela might not be the last target of the United States. Hold on tight, because we have Donald Trump, who just stated that Colombia is governed by a sick man who doesn't have much time left, before adding Operation Colombia ? That sounds good to me. In other words, after the operation in Venezuela that we just discussed, the American president is clearly suggesting that Colombia could be the next major geopolitical target. Major. Will there be movements elsewhere on Polymarket? I'll talk to you about that in just a moment, because that's exactly what happened with Venezuela. But to get back to Colombia, not only are tensions rising in South America, but Washington also seems ready to expand its influence in the region. And why is this important for us crypto investors? Because in fact, at this level, markets always react to political uncertainty, and commodities, energy, and Latin American currencies can all move, and move very quickly. And when uncertainty rises, it's often Bitcoin that becomes the risk barometer, especially when traditional markets are closed, like this weekend. All this information I share with you on Kojo here, and I also give you early access to the daily video. So don't hesitate if you want exclusive access to these videos, this information, and to access highly effective indicators. You've got Kojo as well, and you can actually get the daily video in advance. But we're going to keep a close eye on all this, because if Venezuela has already triggered an immediate reaction in the price of BTC, a new escalation could definitely move the market. A second time in one direction or the other, because as if the geopolitical situation hadn't been explosive enough for the past 48 hours, it's become completely crazy, totally insane. Donald Trump has added another layer to it. We're talking about Venezuela, we're talking about Colombia, but according to him, we absolutely need Greenland. So here he's talking about the United States. And honestly, when I saw this information, you might think it's some kind of fantasy. Except here we're talking about a territory that is strategic on several levels, with natural resources, with a key geopolitical position between America and Europe, and above all, one that controls maritime routes that are becoming increasingly important as the ice melts. And in fact, it's not a joke, because the United States is looking to massively strengthen its influence and its access to natural resources. Exactly like what we saw with the operation in Venezuela. And from a market perspective, this kind of statement maintains a climate of global instability. And in these moments, assets considered as geopolitical hedges like gold, but also Bitcoin, can become very reactive. Above all, what you need to know is that if investors start to anticipate precisely a new wave of American intervention, that could be one more factor confirming that 2026 is likely to be one of the most eventful years of the decade. In any case, this year is already off to a very strong start. Also, there's a rather troubling detail, if I may say so, which went quite unnoticed but definitely deserves to be pointed out. Yet another one. Because just a few hours before the capture of Nicolas Maduro, there were 3 portfolios on Polymarket that placed massive bets on the ousting of the Venezuelan president. And as a result, we're talking about $630,484 in total winnings. And the most impressive part of all this is that a single wallet alone scooped up over $400,000. And when you look at the details, it gets even more suspicious, because these addresses were created just a few days earlier. And they hardly did anything else. And they didn't even bet on events outside of Venezuela or Maduro. Exactly like what happened a few hours later. So obviously it's impossible to say anything with 100% certainty. But this kind of activity always raises the same question. Who knows what? And above all, when do they know it? Once again, we don't have all the information, but this is clearly an example that shows insiders exist and are the first to take advantage of this market volatility. In short, it's pretty fascinating. I'm not going to skip over the news. I'll also share more details with you on Kojo. Here, but you tell me, what do you think about Venezuela? What do you think about this theory? When it comes to oil, when it comes to Bitcoin, you also mentioned Colombia, Greenland, which seems completely crazy. Anyway, in any case, I had a blast doing this research and talking to you about it in the daily update. That's the goal. Don't hesitate to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Go check out Kojo. Take advantage of all the indicators and build your investment journal to become a better investor every day. And not just at the beginning of the year. See you soon. This was Julian. It was a real pleasure. Bye-bye.